All right, so this is what Mick asked me to talk about, the phases of loading with respect to the surface functional properties. So I need to take you back a bit to London 2012, perhaps, where we and Mick and also Lars, who's on the call as well today, one of the presenters today, and Alison Northrop, who's also presenting a little bit later, measured the surface there at the Olympics, and it was quite a challenge because it was up on a raised platform on Greenwich Park where there had to be nothing, sort of no footprint after the event. So the equine surfaces white paper came as a result of the development of the techniques, really. And we also developed terminology related to the functional properties of surfaces for everybody, really, so that everybody could have an understanding of some of the key important properties of surfaces that were going to impact on the horse. There was also, Lars' group helped to develop a guide, which is more of a practical guide, but within it are some wonderful diagrams that illustrate these functional properties, and we'll be having a look at some of those today. So if I just open the chapter there to the first slide in relation to the hoof-ground interaction, and this image you may have seen already, it's from the white paper on racing surfaces, and I really need to acknowledge Jeff Thomason for this. I've been told by Mick many times that he created this particular image. And so what we have here are the phases of loading. So when the foot's on the ground and all those different components of it. So if we look at the hoof at initial loading, which is called concussion there, or primary impact, so 1 degree impact, you can see there's a dotted line that's pointing vertically, and that's related to the amount of deceleration of the hoof when it initially strikes the ground. At that point, it's quite low load because it's only really, it's only really the hoof that's in contact with the ground at that time. And so we've got a low mass situation, but we've also got a high deceleration situation. And that relates really to the very top of the surface. So how the surface is prepared, or the grass sward, will have a big influence on those values. If we then go to secondary impact, so when the hoof slides and stops, then we're thinking about the braking forces and the amount that the hoof actually brakes. At this point, the limb's beginning to load. The influence, obviously, in relation to the surface is going to be in relation to grip. And so the amount of force, the frictional characteristics between the hoof and the ground, and also the shear resistance of the surface are going to have an impact on secondary impact and how that is for the horse. If we then go to the support phase, so the body's descended, if you like, to its maximum amount, and the maximum amount of force is now on the limb. And so we've got a peak force value, and this is generally known as support. And the reaction from the ground is also going to be at a peak, and the amount that the ground absorbs that force relates to the amount of cushioning. So that's our property related to it. And the whole depth of the surface is going to be important in relation to how large that force actually is. And then during propulsion, obviously it's important if the horse is going at speed, that it wants to maintain that particular speed. And so the propulsive phase is also important. The amount of grip is going to be important, particularly the amount of shear resistance of the surface for the horse to push against it. And then right at the bottom, we've got responsiveness. And in some ways, responsiveness covers the whole of the surface interaction, if you like, in relation to the time that it occurs, and also whether there's any kind of energy recovery, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's the sort of the basics. So now let's have a look in a little bit more detail. So if we take impact firmness, we define that as the shock experienced by the horse and rider when the hoof contacts the surface. And it can go from hard to soft. And as I said, it relates to a sort of a low mass, high deceleration type of an event. So if we look at some of the research related to that, here we have, first of all, this is from Chateau et al. So it's a French group that developed this work. They did a lot of work with trotters. This particular graph's from 2010. And what we can see here that's highlighted there in red is the difference between the shock or the acceleration due to impact on an asphalt surface whilst trotting compared to the acceleration on deep, dry sand. And the difference, the difference is quite marked there. So you can see that sort of on this hard asphalt surface, you've got a peak deceleration or a peak acceleration, if it's measured with the accelerometer, of 2,000 meters per second squared, which if we convert that into G's, that's divide by 9.81. So it's going to be somewhere around about 200 G's as a peak, as opposed to sort of about the 10th of the size on deep, dry sand. And there's also, you can see it's very spiky here. So that means we've got a high vibration frequency there in terms of sort of the harmonics rather of vibration. Compared to deep, dry sand, where we've literally just got sort of a very shallow sort of dip there, which is suggesting that there's very little vibration at all. In relation to how this affects the horse, well, this is an older study and there are one or two others, but this is quite a nice one where accelerometers were placed on the hoof wall, the distal phalanx, proximal phalanx and metacarpus, to look at how that vibration sort of transmitted through the limbs. And what they found was that actually in this particular situation, when the hoof contacted the ground, the hoof wall experienced 136 Gs, which went down to 39 Gs at the distal phalanx, and then became quite insignificant by the time we got to the proximal phalanx and metacarpus. So in other words, the hoof and the distal phalanx sort of damped most of the impact vibration within the limb. And in that context, you can obviously sort of appreciate that for a hard surface where you've got high peak acceleration and vibration frequencies, that potentially the hoof wall and distal phalanx are going to be most affected by those particular conditions. When we're thinking about the OBST, which we use for measuring the functional properties as a gold standard, then we obviously would want to measure it looking at an acceleration. Here we have a triaxial accelerometer, which is at the level of the hoof component. So that's measuring impact firmness for us. Okay, so moving on to grip. So the definition, how much the horse's foot slides during landing, turning and pushing off. And we can go from high grip to very slippery. And as I said, the amount of friction between the hoof and the surface, and also the shear resistance within the surface, is going to affect that. So here we have one of our studies back from 2012, two different surfaces. This is actually the same horse. I'll try and get the videos to time at the same time if I can, almost. And hopefully you can see that there's actually a difference there in relation to the amount that the foot slides on landing of those two different surfaces. Now they have a different wax content, and I'm hoping that you can see the difference between them in terms of the amount of hoof slide of this horse. It's quite a nice, consistent landing there from this particular horse. When we actually measured it, the difference was 7.6 centimeters for the surface on hopefully your left-hand side and 4.9 on the right-hand side. and the surface on the right-hand side had a higher wax content and was a competition surface compared to the training surface on the left-hand side. So it wouldn't be unsurprising to suggest that you might expect to see a higher grip, so more shear resistance in a surface with a higher wax component. If we also think about the hoof surface interaction, obviously then shoes are going to be important, and this is one of mixed groups studies here about looking at different types of shoes. And in this particular study, what they actually found, looking at the 3 different shoes and 3 different surfaces, and these, I hasten to add, were measured with, they were measured using the hoof tester rather than with horses themselves, and the significance actually was between the 3 different surfaces rather than the shoes themselves. I'm sure Mick can expand on that if there's any questions about it later. Okay, in terms of measuring grip, we have a triaxial load cell on the OBST, and that allows us to measure the forces in the horizontal direction or in the direction of motion. And if we do 2 integrations of that, that will allow us to measure displacement, which we've been using to measure grip for the functional properties. There we go. Okay, so moving on to cushioning. So cushioning, how much a surface is supportive compared to how much it gives when riding on it. And we can go from cushioning from compacted to deep. Obviously, because it relates to peak force, then the implication there is for the horse is in relation to overload, very much so. And so those situations are something that we sort of need to bear in mind. So here we have the study again from the French group who looked at trotters. And this is a really nice study, and the graphs, hopefully on the right-hand side, will help us to explain those differences in so just beyond just peak forces. So, hang on a second. Right, so here we have the black line relates to a firm wet sand surface, whereas the grey line relates to a deep wet sand surface. The larger curves there are for the vertical force, and then the curves below here are for the horizontal force in the direction of motion. The difference here that's perhaps just a slight bit different to actually measuring ground reaction forces is that this is attached to a force shoe. So it's the horse and the applied force. So actually, if the hoof sinks into the surface, the measurements aren't going to be directly related to the ground level, but they'll be related to whether that hoof's sunk into the surface or not. So there is a little bit of compensation there. Having said that, the findings from this study are really helpful in terms of thinking about how the horse has to perform if there's a difference in the amount of force coming from the ground in the reaction, in terms of how much more effort they may need to put in to maintain the same speed, so to be able to do the same thing. So on the deeper surface, on the deep wet sand surface, what you find here is, and here we go, so here's our vertical forces, there is a reduced and a later peak vertical force. The implications of that is that the deep wet sand surface is not really providing in the same way as the firm wet sand surface enough force to be able to help the horse to support body weight during the speeds that the horse is trotting at. In that case, there has to be some compensation, and this is in the horizontal forces. So if I just point to those for a minute, just remembering that the lighter grey line relates to the deep wet sand. So what you see there is a much earlier transition from braking to propulsion. So we have our little braking forces there. So, So above the zero line there are the braking forces for the deep wet sand. And so you can see that that's a much earlier transition into the negative forces, so the propulsive forces here. So there's a greater propulsive impulse, and so the horse has to produce more effort to be able to continue to go forwards and maintain the same speed. They also found in this study that because of that, there was an increased stride frequency. So for the horse to continue at the same speed, they had to increase their stride frequency and also increase their stance duration. So that a longer time on the ground, in other words, just to be able to produce enough force to keep going. This particular study looked at the same surface, whether it was harrowed and when it was rolled. And we looked at the kinematics of the lower limb and how they changed over those two conditions. And so what we have here, the top row relates to the inclination of the cannon bone. And so it gives you an indication of how much the horse's limbs swung in. So if we look at the sort of the zero line there, so below the zero line, we have adduction. So in other words, the limbs swinging in more. Above the line, we have abduction, which means it will be swinging out more. And then the bottom graphs relate to the angle of the fetlock joint. So if we get a lower value, there's greater extension. In terms of the colours, on the harrowed surface, we've got the darker colours, and on the rolled surface, we've got the lighter colours. This is one of the horses, and it was an example that we used for this particular study. Okay, so what did we find? Well, interestingly, there we go. Okay, so for the harrowed surface, which you may expect would provide more cushioning, so it absorbs more force, and therefore, if it did, you might expect that the fetlock angles or the amount of fetlock extension would actually be reduced. But actually it was increased. So we had more extension on the harrowed surface. These surfaces were actually measured with a Clegg hammer. And when we looked at the difference between the two, and ironically, it came out as being significant, although you would expect that this would have occurred the other way around, that the harrowed surface produced higher hardness values using a Clegg hammer compared to the rolled surface. So we scratched our heads over this quite a lot, because you may have expected that the Clegg hammer values would have been the other way around. You might have expected that the fetlock extension values would have been the other way around. We also had a look at, because the limb swung in a little bit more on the harrowed surface, whether there was a correlation. So was it that the horse was standing underneath itself a bit more, so there's more body weight on the limb, and that would have given us more fetlock extension? And actually there was no correlation, so we didn't find that. Going back to an old paper by Jeremy Byrne a few years beforehand, he suggested that with a surface that was sort of more harrowed, that if the hoof went into the surface and there was a greater amount of shear resistance that kind of held the hoof, then potentially that might mean that you had a high load on the limb, which would fit with these results. And it's certainly something to consider when considering sort of the amount of cushioning that you might expect to see. So if you increase the amount that the limbs held, depending on how that affects the horse and how it then loads its limbs, it may well be that it will have an influence in relation to increasing cushioning. Okay. So how do we measure it? Well, not surprisingly, we use the vertical component of a load cell. And so there we go on the hoof tester, and that will give us the amount of cushioning for any specific surface. Okay, so then moving on to responsiveness. This seems to always be the functional property that's most difficult to understand. And I suppose because its effect relates to the whole of the stance phase, then possibly that's why. So how active or springy the surface feels to the rider. So if we think about that, it could go from very active to quite dead, and it could go from sort of quite fast to quite slow, and that gives us really, I suppose, the two components that relate to, the two components that relate to it. So the amount of recovery of that surface, so elastic recovery is one component, and then the timing of it is really the other component. And this is my favorite, one of my favorite images to try and explain responsiveness, from Thelwell, who was, I loved Thelwell when I was a child, and it gives us a really good explanation of how a horse might benefit from some elastic recovery that occurs at the right time. So, okay, let's just look at this from a slightly more serious perspective. If we think about Ratzlaff, and this is quite an old study now, but a really nice one in terms of thinking about the timing of the response of the surface. And here we have a graph where we've got the forces produced by a horse and then a test device that he used to measure the surface. And he was interested to know whether the timings, or when the timings occurred in relation to the stance phase, in terms of the response, in terms of the response of that surface. And what you can see here from this graph is that the sort of the recovery of that surface occurs after peak load. So in other words, during the propulsive phase. And if it was going to help the horse, you would expect that that's when the horse would need it the most. If it occurs after the horse has left the ground, then it's obviously not going to be very helpful at all, or it might not occur at all if it's a very sort of deformable surface that's very sort of plastic in the way it behaves. It will probably absorb all of the, an amount of force, but not provide any recovery. But the other possible scenario here is that it occurs quite early, and I'm not sure whether you perhaps experience sometimes, or if you think about it, you might experience these things on a very hard surface, where you might have a very fast recovery, elastic recovery, and if it occurs before the body weight of the horse has completely descended, then potentially it's going to increase the amount of peak vertical force on the limbs even more, which could be really detrimental. So actually the responsiveness of the surface is really quite an important component when we think about it. Okay, so responsiveness, how do we measure it? Well, it's a bit more complicated because it's a spring mass damper system for the OBST. So what we have done is mainly look at the timing, although I know Lars is now tending to look as well at the elastic component within the surface. And for the timing component, we actually look at the spring deformation velocity versus the spring recovery velocity as the OBST is unloading to calculate responsiveness. So then if we're moving on to the sort of the final property, if we're going to look at a surface at one particular time point, and that's uniformity. So how regular the surface feels when the horse moves across it. So obviously the look of a surface is probably going to give you an indication of that. But actually what we're really interested in is knowing how the combination of functional properties vary over the extent of that surface. And the image that we see, the image that we see here on the right-hand side relates to, this one actually relates to the cushioning functional property. And it relates to a surface that was laid in two parts on 2 different days. And the blue areas that you can see going over to sort of really quite dark blue relate to sort of lower values of cushioning, whereas the green and dark green values relate to higher values. So you can see how much variation there is across the whole of that surface. It's not the same surface as in the image, I have to say, but the surface itself looked very flat and even, but actually when you look to the functional properties underneath it, they were really quite different, and the horse would have experienced a quite different performance and different reaction from the ground when it was moving around this particular arena. Okay, so in terms of studies, Murray looked at risk factors, and obviously one of the big risks relates to tripping. Sort of the horse's balance is quite possibly going to be affected by a different response from the ground, depending on the functional properties at that particular point. We did a study, one of the PhD students we had did a study 2-3 years ago, and that was looking at a surface that had been deep harrowed on one side and sort of pretty much left for over 12 months on the other side, and that was a wax sand and fibre surface, but just prepared so that it looked quite different. So there was a significant difference in the functional properties in terms of cushioning. And what we wanted to do was to take the horses, these were in-hand horses, just trotting over the surface, look at whether the first time that they went over and then subsequent times to see if there was a difference in the way they moved across the surface, whether they knew it was different or not. And actually there was a difference. So this difference is the sort of one of the main differences we found in terms of the fall in motion, that the amount of fall in retraction at lift off, so that's how much the limb was retracted before it lifted off and moved into the swing phase, was greater when the horse wasn't aware of the change. So that was only the first trial. And then as they became aware of the change, they actually started to modify their gait according to that. And they reduced the amount of retraction when they were going from the one surface to the next surface. So, I mean, I'm sure sort of often, I think Mick sent me a great video just yesterday, or the day before, where in the race, a horse was obviously anticipating a change because there was a change in colour of the grass, and leapt over it, whereas some of the biggest problems for the horses will relate to an unanticipated change where the top of the surface looks identical, but actually something underneath has changed, and therefore the horse won't necessarily be supported in the same way, or the responsiveness might be altered, or the grip characteristics may have changed. So we can see here that from this particular study, the movement patterns were altered once the horse had started to learn the difference between those two parts of surface that it was moving across. Okay, so I think that concludes the functional properties that I wanted to talk about, and I know Lars and Alison are going to talk about them in more depth in relation to application. So thank you very much for listening.
This is Karen, and this is her land. She's been here a long time, along with Mojo. The first fence post went up here. Now there's 5,000 of them. After the storm, she started the cleanup here. And when she needs some peace and quiet, she always finds it right here. This is more than just land, it's home. Karen runs with us on a John Deere 3E Series tractor, because who says a day's work has to take all day? Nothing runs like a Deere. Search John Deere 3E Series for more.
Being a teenager and in high school and middle school is not easy for girls these days. And they get to come here, spend time working around the farm, spend time with the animals, and not feel that pressure until we go to horse shows. The first time I saw this land, I was about 12 years old. I came here with an old mentor. I fell in love with it as a little girl, and I said I was gonna own it one day. My mother, when I was 4 years old, put me on a little pony walking around the zoo. That was it for me. Love at first sight. Like any kid, when I was younger, I wanted to compete more in the Olympics and go Grand Prix and do things like that. But I put that all on the side and realized I had a different agenda in life. I've taught about 800 kids in this area. A typical day starts early in the morning with feeding the horses. Then usually we clean stalls. This is a daily chore, sometimes twice a day. I'm always on the tractor, mowing, spreading things around, you name it. This is a John Deere 3025P. I love my tractor. I couldn't live without it. I like to just relax and be left alone. I call it my husband. He's very reliable, and it doesn't argue. It's so easy to use. My 68-year-old mother has never driven anything like this before, and she was scared to death of it. And once she did, she loves it. She drives it all the time for me and helps me out around the farm. Being here in Florida, we deal with a lot of hurricanes, so it can be very stressful when we're in the path of one. That John Deere helps me so much. We go around picking up debris, moving, pushing things with the bucket. I always have an average of 50 students, so whenever there's a disaster that comes around, they're always here and they're ready to work. I call all my girls my kids. They're like part of my family, and they get scholarships for riding, and so we try to keep our sport here a little bit serious but fun. We go to the horse shows. It's great for them. Good, very nice. Teaches them a lot of sportsmanship, how to be more in charge and have more self-confidence. A little stronger on that. There. The parents tell me all the time, you are such a huge influence in our child's life. I love to share my experience with these girls and be able to steer them in a better path. Everybody always asks me, how do you keep doing this? I say, just the sheer passion of it. What am I gonna do? Get a condo on the beach somewhere? I'm happier here. I'm Karen Neese, and this is my land.